Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are several problems with this NDP motion. First, it lacks respect for the Supreme Court. Second, it lacks respect for the provinces. And the NDP will be helping the government because the government would prefer discuss the Senate rather than the $90,000. And worse, even worse, the effect of the motion would be to put an end to the federal government as a whole. Therefore, the motion is completely ridiculous.
On today's motion from the NDP, we were taken by surprise. We had assumed that their caucus, and in particular their Treasury Board critic, would understand the effects that the proposal would have on the government. In short, it would lead to the total shutdown of the Canadian government by the end of this fiscal year. We couldn't imagine that that was the intent of the New Democrats. However, I was reminded that one should never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by ignorance. And it is our conclusion in this corner of the House that the NDP may very well be completely unaware of how the federal government works. Mr. Speaker, it's clear what the NDP are trying to do, push forward their agenda for the federal government to unilaterally abolish the Senate. Liberals cannot agree with that short-sighted and frankly unconstitutional plan. We are also deeply troubled by the means to which the NDP are willing to go to further this agenda, including shutting down the entire Canadian government, and many provincial governments too, I might add. First, let me address the underlying point, Senate reform. Despite what you hear from Conservatives and New Democrats, Liberals are not opposed to Senate reform. We are not pushing for the status quo. What we are opposed to is unconstitutional declarations from high atop the Hill in Ottawa demanding changes to the Senate. And let's be perfectly clear here. That is what the NDP are proposing. For all their talk about consultations with the provinces, they have decided what the outcome of those discussions will be. That is not consultation. Provinces deserve to have a real voice in this matter. Before we enter any sort of discussion on Senate reform, Canadians, as well as our provincial and federal governments, need to know the terms under which the discussion will take place. This issue is now before the Supreme Court of Canada. This is the responsible way to handle this matter. In fact, Liberals have been asking the government to do this for years, and the government delayed forever. However, the Conservatives only wanted the appearance of action. Privately, they know that changes to the Senate will require complex and messy negotiations with the provinces. The NDP are following right behind the Conservatives. They don't care about hearing from the court because they know deep down their policy is unworkable. My colleague, the member for Saint-Laurent-Cartierville and the Liberal Democratic Reform critic, has done a lot of work on this file, and I've spoken to him a great deal about the matter of Senate reform. So let me quote from the member at some length, Mr. Speaker, regarding the complexities of Senate reform.
Many Canadians would rather senators be elected than appointed, and that's understandable because it would be more democratic. However, what would happen if, as the Harper government proposes, we would change the way people are appointed to the Senate without amending the Constitution accordingly? If we do what the Conservatives want, this is what would happen. There would be a lack of mechanisms to resolve any disagreement between the House and the Senate, permanent underrepresentation of Alberta and BC, with 6 senators each versus 10 for New Brunswick, paralysis, American style, and now, or Italian style, due to the entrenched conflicts between the House and the Senate, and constitutional dispute with regard to the number of senators each province would be entitled to. So let's start at the beginning. Would the provinces agree on seat distribution in the Senate? If so, we would have to decide on the constitutional powers the Senate should have in order that there be harmony with the House of Commons rather than doubling powers, thus leading to paralysis. After that, we would have to decide on how to elect senators and how the Constitution would be amended accordingly. If provinces cannot agree on how many seats each province is entitled to, there would be constitutional chaos. So, rather than move in that direction, let's ask the Prime Minister, who is ultimately responsible for the quality of the people named to the Senate, and let's let the Senate continue to play the role which it was given by the Fathers of Confederation, that is, a chamber of sober second thought. End of quote. It was a long quote, but I think that it shows that there is a reasonable way to reform the Senate.
So these are not simple questions, Mr. Speaker. The Senate is the body of regional representation for the provinces. Provincial governments are not going to sit idly by while the new Democratic caucus decides for them what should happen to the Senate. And let's be perfectly honest about this point. Consultations on how to abolish the Senate are not consultations on Senate reform. However, Mr. Speaker, I'd now like to turn my attention to the quite incredible motion now before the House. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, I do not attribute any malice to the actions of the NDP. Rather, I believe the motion stems from a lack of understanding as to how the Government of Canada spends money. This motion is poorly constructed. It is simply not clear what the member is calling for. Does he simply want the annual appropriations of the Senate zeroed out, as his colleague from Winnipeg Centre has proposed for tonight's supply votes? Or is the NDP also calling for the amendments to the Parliament of Canada Act that are required if we are to remove senators' salaries? I will give my colleague the benefit of the doubt, as I hope it was not their intent to leave senators with no work but a full salary. However, it's clear that their intent is to shut the Senate down without making the necessary amendments to the Canadian Constitution. It's as if they think they have found a way around our founding laws and can perform an end run around the Supreme Court in the provinces. This motion does not abolish the Senate. It renders it inoperative. It does not matter how much you dislike the Senate. It is a needed part of our government under the Constitution. We should consider the effect that this proposal would have on our government. The Senate would still exist. In fact, there is a good chance senators would still get paid. However, some changes would be noticed on July 1st, the day in which the money is cut off. The hallway and offices down the hall would go dark. Senate security guards and staff in the other place would be laid off. This would be most unfortunate for our House colleagues who have offices in the East Bloc. We wouldn't notice any serious changes until the fall, when Parliament returned from the summer recess. It is then that the legislative backup would begin. Section 55 of the Constitution Act, meaning it cannot be changed by this Parliament alone, states where a bill passed by the Houses of Parliament is presented to the Governor-General for the Queen's assent, etc., etc. So the Constitution says that bills have to be passed by both Houses of Parliament. And so if the NDP gets rid of the Senate, we couldn't pass any legislation, and that includes money bills, supply bills. In layman's terms, Mr. Speaker, you need the consent of both Houses of Parliament to enact legislation. There is no way around this except through a constitutional amendment. Now, as opposition MPs, neither Liberals nor New Democrats may have that big of a problem with the government not being able to get their ideological agenda through. However, private members' business also grinds to a halt. Supply bills will cease to pass. Mr. Speaker, I think this would be a good opportunity to explain to my NDP colleagues exactly how the Government of Canada spends money, as they don't seem to understand the process very well. Any expenditure must be authorized by a law passed by both Houses of Parliament. The only exception to this is during a general election, and only during a general election, when the government may use Governor-General's special warrants. This is the only exception. The authorizations for spending, known as an appropriation, comes one of two ways. Either there is an existing statute that provides an ongoing authorization to spend funds, or the appropriation comes from the annual supply bills that we pass. My colleagues may be more familiar with the supply bills process, as those bills are supported by the estimates that we review periodically in this House and in committee. In fact, we're dealing with two supply bills this evening. Now, it is important, Mr. Speaker, to consider what spending has to be authorized each and every year by Parliament, as I don't believe the NDP has given any thought to this. Voted spending, the appropriations we have to approve every year, fund the operations of the government. Funding for civil service salaries, power and heating bills, and printer paper all need to be authorized every year. None of this could be authorized with a defunded Senate. This brings me back to the April 1st, 2014, the date the NDP want the Government of Canada to shut down completely. That's the beginning of the next fiscal year. All the funding we have approved this year expires on March 31st. It doesn't matter if government departments scrimp and save in anticipation of the shutdown, the appropriations simply expire. This would be somewhat similar to when Newt Gingrich forced the U.S. government to shut down in 1995 and 1996. But it turns out that the U.S. is prepared for such an eventuality. The Anti-Deficiency Act allows for some government employees to remain paid and employed so that certain entitlement programs, like Social Security and public safety operations, continue during a government shutdown. Canada has no such contingency. Under the NDP plan, April 1st, 2014 would be a dark day in Canadian history. The Canadian Armed Forces would shut down. The RCMP would cease to be paid. Corrections Services Canada would shutter. Canadians would rightly be worried by these events, but if they turned to the CBC for information on what was going on, they would be sorely disappointed. The CBC relies heavily on annual appropriations. Canadians could call the government to register their concerns, but government phone lines would also go unanswered. The phones would ring, but nobody would be there to answer them. Automatic processes would continue for a little bit. According to Hydro Ottawa, you have about 40 days to pay your bill before they can cut your power off. Without the ability to pay rent, many departments would be evicted from their office buildings across the country. Almost certainly, other countries would want to offer assistance to the suddenly governmentless Canadians. However, all of our embassies abroad would be closed. Here in Ottawa, the Department of Foreign Affairs would be dark. Canadians are a resilient group of people, Mr. Speaker. We would adapt. I'm sure many Canadians would enjoy the now unfettered access to cross-border shopping. Remember, CBSA wouldn't be functional anymore. Luckily, many services Canadians rely on are delivered by our provincial governments, such as health and education. But wait, Mr. Speaker, almost every province relies on the CRA to collect their income taxes. Provinces that have an HST rely on the CRA to collect that as well. Provincial governments also rely on billions in transfer payments from the federal government for healthcare, education, housing, and other social services. These payments would stop because there would be no staff to administer them. Provincial governments would be left scrambling to find enough funding to deliver the services Canadians rely on from them. They would have no choice but to run massive deficits. I would ask the New Democrats, did you consult with the premiers about this? How would the NDP premiers of Nova Scotia and Manitoba feel about their federal party's plans? Remember, Canadians would need that provincial health care, as the Canadian Food Inspection Agency would also be completely defunded. No more food inspections. Mr. Speaker, Canadians should also be rightly concerned about what would happen to their CPP, their EI, their OAS and GIS under this plan. The funding for those transfer payments is statutory in nature. It doesn't need annual renewal. But there would be no one to administer those programs. There would be no more civil service left. We simply don't know how long those programs would last, maybe until they got their hydro cut off. We do know that if anyone had a problem with these services, they would be out of luck. Mr. Speaker, these are the problems that Canadians would immediately face. That is to say, nothing for the granting councils, the Canada Council for the Arts, government research and investment would cease to exist. This is not a worst-case scenario. This is the outcome of the NDP motion. I was shocked yesterday to read an interview with the New Democratic Treasury Board critic where he said he expected that Senate staff should simply volunteer their time to pass bills. It's as if none of the hard-working staff of the Senate have a family to feed. It was always the contention of the NDP that they were the party of Labour. How do they justify throwing 400 people out of work and then telling them that instead of finding new work, they need to show up and volunteer their time? Not only that, this army of 400 volunteers would have to spend their own money to print things like the order paper in Hansard just to keep the place running. Mr. Speaker, we are left with three possible explanations for today's NDP motion, none of which are particularly comforting. First, this is nothing but a cynical political ploy.
Two, they don't get it.
Second, as I alluded at the beginning of my remarks, maybe they just don't understand how our government works.
Don't get it.
And the third explanation is the most concerning, Mr. Speaker. Maybe we are witnessing the NDP's version of federalism. By reducing the Senate's appropriations to zero, the NDP would be dropping an atom bomb into the middle of federal-provincial relations. The provinces would be forced to consent to the NDP's abolition plan, or they would be faced with no tax money and no transfers on April 1st. I think I've said enough, Mr. Speaker, to demonstrate that this motion is entirely idiotic. Not only does it fail to respect the Supreme Court and the provinces, not only does it let the government off the hook in terms of the debate about the role of the PMO and the $90,000, but it is inane, it is idiotic, it is stupid, it is farcical, because it would result in the complete shutdown of the federal government and many of the provincial governments. So it obviously shows the NDP is not fit to govern, and the best advice I can give to sensible NDP members of Parliament is to vote against their own ridiculous motion.
Stupid bill.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Kapuskasing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's obvious that when the Liberals were in power, they couldn't clean that house, and the Conservatives can't clean that house now either. So let me read you something that one of my constituents actually wrote here. And this is Margaret McMillan from White River. Yes, from White River. Constituents in our neck of the woods are extremely disappointed with the government of the three known individuals, as there may be more who have scammed the people and are not being fired. Even though the funds upon audit are repaid, that does not excuse the theft.
Order. Order. The Honourable Member for Winnipeg South Centre on a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Did we not just all learn at question period that we, under the Big Green Book, are not able to bring specific constituency examples into this House?
I thank one at a time. I thank the Honourable Member for Winnipeg South Centre for her intervention. I'll take a look at that. I think earlier today the reference was made to, I think by the Honourable Government House Leader in respect to questions during oral questions. Having said that, I do recall that the practice of citing specific references and or quotations from individual constituents or Canadians is not something that is encouraged in the House. But I will look into that, and we'll get back to the House as may be necessary. The Honourable Member for Scarborough-Agincourt, is this on the same
Mr.
point
Speaker,
of order?
on the same point of order, if we're not here to represent our constituents and to bring their views and quote-unquote say what they're telling us, then who the heck are we here for?
I think that's probably just the court adding to the same point. As I said, we'll get back to the House as may be necessary on the question. The Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Kapuskasing.
So she goes on to say that they cannot explain this theft away with "I did not understand." It was a fully knowledgeable theft. Personally, I will check out exactly what these overpaid politicians do in the Senate. It is some sort of a retirement position, I think. The entire government, in my mind, looked like fools not demanding firing. So just on that note, the issue before us is to not fund the Senate. And I can tell you that when it deals with the Constitution after that, we are prepared to deal with that after the fact. But this is the biggest piece that we have here. But on this specific note, I'm just wondering whether or not it is the opinion of the Liberals that when someone is caught red-handed as Mr. Duffy has been, as this senator and some other ones, do they not think that they shouldn't be above the law, that they should also be charged by the police? Thank you.
Well, Member for Markham Unionville.
Of course we think that people should pay the money back, and then it's up to the authorities to decide whether or not to lay criminal charges. But I wonder if the honourable member was listening to my speech, because I tried to explain in very simple language that this is a ridiculous motion, the effect of which would be to close down the whole federal government. So I don't know how any of these NDP members can continue to support their own motion, which would have disastrous effects on this country and which would never have been put by anybody who had the slightest understanding of how the government works.
Questions? I just want to advise honourable members there's a great deal of interest in questions and comments today. I'd ask honourable members to keep their interventions to no more than a minute. That also applies to those who are responding. The honourable member for Winnipeg South Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I really appreciate the comments from the honourable member from Markham Unionville. Specifically, I have two questions for this gentleman, who is a lawyer and who has a lot of background. It is somewhat alarming that the motion put forward by the NDP today is not constitutional. And we heard earlier from the honourable minister that even a 5-year-old child has to be told about process and the importance of process. So my first question for the honourable member is, number one, comments on the process, because I personally found the speech somewhat alarming. And the other question, when there was a coalition being considered in 2008, the NDP, and the honourable member would know very clearly that the NDP were already naming who they would appoint to the Senate. Really? Could you enlighten us on that issue, sir?
Member for Markham Unionville.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't take this as an insult, but I'm not a lawyer. I'm an economist. And I think the process was described in that long quote I had from my colleague as one sensible process. I mean, this motion is just ridiculous, as I said earlier. But we can't really do anything on the process until we hear from the Supreme Court. And we had recommended a year ago, I think, to refer to the Supreme Court. Finally, the government has. So I don't think there's much point having big discussions on Senate reform until we hear from the Supreme Court, because that will tell us the legitimate constitutional paths.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Charlottetown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much enjoyed the speech by the member from Union Markhamville, but Markham Unionville, excuse me. But one of the he posed a question that I'd like to hear the answer to. He indicated that this motion is grounded in one of three possibilities. Either it's a cynical political stunt, it reflects a misunderstanding on the part of the NDP as to how government works, or it reflects the NDP's idea of federalism. And he left it as an open question. I would invite him to answer it. Thank you.
Well, member for Markham Unionville.
Well, I thank my colleague. I get called a lawyer by a conservative and the wrong riding by one of my own colleagues, but so it's not my day, perhaps. But I would say it's all of the above.
I agree.
Particularly 1 and 2. I'm not so sure about 3, but it's certainly a political stunt because they realize the Senate is unpopular these days, so they want that message out. And it certainly, as I indicated in my speech, reflects a total misunderstanding of how the government works.
Questions and comments. Honourable Deputy to Compton Stanstead.
Honourable member for Compton Stanstead. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to try and refrain because it's unbelievable what we're hearing. Comments from an MP with experience, paternalistic and colonial comments saying that it's impossible to make a parliamentary reform when that's unacceptable when the public has seen all the scandals that have been going on for the past few weeks and even the past few years for the Liberals. Well, he says it's impossible to reform it, but that's not true. It's possible, and it's also unacceptable to hear. Listen, in terms of efficiency and effectiveness for the Senate, that's 0. If we had to do a measurement, Canada would be among the worst countries in the world. They have a high level of absenteeism. We don't get value for money. That's not efficient or effective. And to hear that member say that everything would be blocked because we would defund the Senate, well, It's simple. All they have to do is do work on a volunteer basis if they really want to serve their country, because they were elected by, in any case, by the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Unionville. Order.
The honourable member. What is absolutely unacceptable is this absurd and ridiculous motion on the part of the NDP. The NDP should know that there are certain rules of the game. We have a constitution. We have to respect the constitution. We have no choice on that matter, and we have to wait for the Supreme Court for the details. But most experts think that in order to abolish the Senate, we would need the consent of all the provinces plus the federal government. It's not just a motion from the NDP that is going to achieve that. It would require a majority of the provinces or all the provinces.
In the Ottawa bubble, but this is not a serious motion. You know, the NDP want to abolish the Senate, but they know that they don't have the support to do that in this country. Whether you believe it requires the 750 amending formula or it requires the unanimity of 11 legislatures in this country, they realize they don't have the support for that. And not to mention that, you know, majority of their Quebec caucus hasn't responded as to whether or not, you know, the province of Quebec would demand its Meech Lake 5 demands of the recognition of Quebec's nationhood, appointments to the Supreme Court, vetoes over the amending, vetoes for all provinces, opt-out provisions, control of immigration to provincial governments. They haven't responded as to whether or not the province of Quebec would demand that ahead of any abolition of the Senate. So instead what they're trying to do is something to the back door that they can't accomplish to the front door. It reminds me of the tactics, frankly, of what the Republicans are doing in the United States. You know, the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as the Obamacare, passed in the legislature, and instead of ensuring the successful implementation of the act, the GOP has decided to starve it of its funds so as to not allow it to operate. So clearly this motion is nothing more than political grandstanding. It's not a serious proposal from a government that's supposed to be in waiting.
A member for Markham Unionville.
Well, I agree with what my colleague said, but I also think that the government's current plan is not serious. It's also trying to do things through the back door by avoiding the Constitution. I mean, if we have an elected Senate, which is what the government wants, but we have no change in the distribution of seats, it would be grossly unfair to British Columbia and Alberta, who only have 6 seats each, versus New Brunswick has 10, PEI has 4, and so on. So if you're going to have an elected Senate which is more powerful, you have to first deal with the distribution of the seats, and this government appears not to be willing to do that. But again, we will have to see what the Supreme Court says.